What if one day your grandma needed you to take care of her in the hospital? Would you be willing to cancel all your plans, even take days off work to be there for her? I've been in that exact situation. I took time off from work to care for my grandmother, but my parents were different. They didn't care about her at all. My mom even shouted, "We're not her servants." Why did my parents act that way? And how did my grandma punish them for it? Stick around. Let me tell you what happened. Hello, everyone. My name is Wendy. I'm 32 years old, and I live with my husband, William, and our 6-year-old daughter, Emma, in a 3-bedroom house in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado. Our life used to be standard. I worked as a salesperson for a used car dealership downtown. The job wasn't bad, but it wasn't anything special either. I tried to convince customers to buy used cars at reasonable prices every day. William, my husband, managed a family-owned restaurant in our neighborhood. He was great at what he did, running the place, handling the staff, and making customers feel welcome. But then, 2 years ago, everything changed. After something unexpected happened, my grandma gave us $6 million. And this wasn't some regular inheritance or generous gift. That money came from a story full of twists, revealing the true nature of people and family. After that, William and I were grateful and thrilled about the money. But my parents and Morgan have been living with regret ever since because their actions cost them that massive fortune. With the $6 million, we quit our jobs and opened our own restaurant. These days, life feels peaceful and fulfilling. During the day, William and I run the restaurant. In the evenings, we spend time with Emma and my grandma. Emma adores her. She loves listening to the stories Grandma tells about her younger years. Being playful, she sometimes begs Grandma to take her for a walk. And honestly, having Grandma around brings so much warmth into our lives. But more than anything, we're deeply thankful for her, not just because of the money, but because she taught us something far more valuable. She showed us what family means, how to treat the ones we love, and how money can expose who people truly are. Our story began on a Thursday afternoon in May 2023. That day, while I showed a middle-aged man a used car, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Uncle Mike, my dad's younger brother. I was trying to convince the guy to buy a 2018 Honda Accord, so I declined the call. 2 minutes later, my phone vibrated again with a text from Uncle Mike. It read, "Call me back ASAP, Grandma's in the hospital." The moment I read that message, my heart sank. I immediately apologized to the customer and called Uncle Mike right back. His voice on the other end was tense as he told me Grandma had been in an accident and was in the emergency room. Her condition was bad. As soon as the call ended, I rushed to hand over my tasks to a coworker and asked my manager for emergency time off. Thankfully, my boss, Mr. Johnson, was incredibly understanding once he heard what was happening with my grandma. The 15-minute drive from the office to the hospital felt endless. A heavy sense of dread settled in my chest. I prayed repeatedly as I drove, asking God to watch over her. At that point, Grandma was 74. Her health wasn't what it used to be, and an accident at her age could be life-threatening. Memories of her kept flashing like slow-motion clips from old home videos. She had always been the one who cared about me the most in our family. From when I was a kid to now as an adult, she was always the first person I turned to whenever I was in trouble. And now she was the one in danger. When I got to the hospital, I rushed straight to the emergency room. Outside the hallway, I saw Uncle Mike and his wife, Aunt Patricia, sitting there with anxious faces. Uncle Mike stood up and hugged me the moment he saw me, then told me everything. Grandma had been crossing the street when an SUV hit her. She suffered a serious head injury and had lost a lot of blood. The doctors were doing everything they could, but because of her age, her condition was extremely critical. At that point, all of us were praying she would pull through. About 20 minutes after I arrived, something suddenly hit me. It was strange. My parents weren't there. I quickly asked Uncle Mike, "Have you called my parents yet?" As soon as I said it, he sighed and replied, "I called them before I called you. They said they were really busy." I was confused and asked, "Do you know what they're busy with?" Uncle Mike looked at me clearly surprised and asked, "You don't know? I thought you were invited." His words only confused me more. I told him, "I have no idea what you're talking about." At that, frustration and disbelief crossed his face. A few seconds later, he explained, "Tonight, Morgan, your sister, is introducing her boyfriend to the family at the Olive Garden. The dinner's been planned for a while, and they said it couldn't be canceled." Hearing those words left me completely numb. Grandma was still in surgery, her life on the line, and yet they had chosen Morgan's boyfriend's dinner as their top priority. I couldn't wrap my head around that decision. At the same time, I felt hurt and angry. No one had even told me about this dinner. Once again, they had left me out of a major family event. And Morgan, maybe she never really saw me as her sister. A little while later, I remembered I hadn't told William what was happening. I called him right away. When he heard the news, he said he was coming to the hospital immediately, but I asked him to stay calm and instead pick up Emma after school. I told him they could come to the hospital afterward. It wouldn't be too late. By 5:30 p.m., William and Emma had arrived. William was visibly worried. He asked how Grandma was doing, and when he found out she was still in surgery, he started to cry. In that moment, I felt fortunate to have married William, a man who truly understands what matters and has such a kind heart. Not seeing my parents or Morgan anywhere, William asked about them. I told him the whole story. After hearing it, he shook his head and quietly said, "That's just cruel." After what my parents and sister did, I knew one thing. This was only the beginning of the events that would change everything. After more than 3 hours of emergency treatment and timely surgery, Grandma thankfully made it through the critical stage. When Dr. Martinez stepped out of the operating room, his scrubs soaked in sweat, he looked at us and said with a tired but relieved voice, "We were able to save her." Hearing those words made it feel like the weight crushing my chest for hours suddenly lifted. My legs nearly gave out from the sheer relief. However, the doctor continued with a serious tone because they had to perform brain surgery to relieve pressure from the trauma. Grandma wouldn't be waking up right away. Her condition still needed to be closely monitored over the next 24 hours. We were allowed to visit her, but only 2 people at a time and no more than 15 minutes per visit. After the doctor explained everything, Uncle Mike gently touched my shoulder and said, "I'll go in first, then it's your turn." I nodded in agreement. Uncle Mike and Aunt Patricia went in. From the hallway, I watched through the glass of the ICU room. He sat at Grandma's bedside, holding her hand and whispering. Aunt Patricia stood beside him, wiping tears from her face with a tissue. At that moment, I realized how love within a family can be expressed in simple gestures. When it was my turn, William and I stepped into the room. I sat beside Grandma and gently held her wrinkled hands. They were cold and fragile, nothing like the warm, strong hands I remembered from childhood. I leaned in and whispered to her, "Grandma, it's me. You have to stay strong and wake up soon, okay?" Meanwhile, William sat on the other side of the bed, quietly crying the whole time. It was the first time I had ever seen him cry like that, not even during the worst of our financial struggles or in the most stressful moments. Maybe it was because of the special bond he had with Grandma. Since we married, Grandma had always treated William with kindness, honestly, even more lovingly than my sister Morgan. Seeing my husband in tears, I placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "She's going to be okay. Don't worry." William turned to me, wiped his tears, and quietly said, "You know, she's the only one in your family who's ever really cared about me and Emma." Hearing those words, I understood something clearly. Family isn't defined by blood. It's determined by love and how we care for each other. After our 15 minutes were up, William and I left the room. We sat down with Uncle Mike to discuss how we would care for Grandma in the days ahead. Around 8 p.m., Daniel, Uncle Mike's son, arrived at the hospital to visit Grandma. He had been working at a tech company in Seattle, and as soon as Uncle Mike called him with the news, he booked the last flight of the day and flew straight to Colorado. When I saw Daniel walk in, exhausted from the long trip, Uncle Mike hugged him tightly and said with emotion, "Thank you for coming." Daniel responded right away, "Grandma's family, Dad. I couldn't stay in Seattle while she's going through this." At that point, all the people closest to Grandma were there at the hospital, except for my parents and Morgan. That contrast made me feel even more ashamed and angry about how they had acted. That night, Uncle Mike volunteered to stay at the hospital to take care of Grandma. When I offered to stay instead, he shook his head and said, "You've got a husband and a kid. Go home and get some rest. I'll take care of your Grandma." Hearing that, I felt nothing but gratitude and respect. He was showing what it means to be a son, something completely opposite from my parents' cold indifference. As I stepped out of the hospital into the night, I looked up at the starry sky and wondered if more tests were ahead for our family. And deep down, I just kept hoping Grandma would wake up soon. That night, after getting home and tucking Emma into bed, I decided I was going to call my dad. It was time for a serious conversation about his lack of concern earlier that day. After 2 rings, his voice came through the line. It was curt and gruff as he asked, "What is it?" I immediately knew, from the sound of his voice, he had been drinking, probably a lot, at that dinner tonight. But I wasn't in the mood to be polite anymore. Without hesitation, I asked firmly, "Why didn't you and Mom come to the hospital to check on Grandma?" Dad, clearly half drunk, replied dismissively, "I was busy." That cold, careless response lit a fire in me. I gripped the phone tightly and shot back, "What could possibly be more important than the health of the woman who gave birth to you?" That question must have hit a nerve, because he snapped and shouted into the phone, "Don't you lecture me. I'm your father." His voice was loud enough to blast through the speaker. Sitting next to me, William heard it all and looked at me with concern. He gently reached for my hand and shook his head, telling me to back off. Seeing his face, I forced myself to calm down. I knew arguing with a drunk man would go nowhere. I hung up without saying another word. No goodbye. My hand was still shaking with anger. Still fuming, I made another decision. I would call Morgan. I needed to hear her side. Maybe, just maybe, she had something to say that made sense. When she answered, I kept my tone controlled and asked, "So, your boyfriend is more important than Grandma being in the emergency room, huh?" I thought she might show some guilt, or at least give an explanation, but instead she answered coldly and firmly. "Matthew is a business director at a major company. His schedule was set in advance. He couldn't cancel." That hit hard, but she wasn't done. She added, "You and Uncle Mike were already at the hospital, right? So stop blowing this out of proportion." That last sentence pushed me over the edge. My voice sharpened as I asked, "Who are you saying is blowing this out of proportion?" She didn't answer. She hung up. I called again. She declined. Called a third time. Same thing. Seeing my frustration, William reached over, placed his hand on mine, and said softly, "Let it go. They'll face the consequences of what they've done." I set the phone down on the table, but inside I couldn't let it go. I couldn't forget how they had behaved today. Both my dad and Morgan had chosen meaningless priorities over Grandma's life. Sitting there in the silence of the night, I asked myself a question I never thought I'd have to. Do I even know my family at all? Had I lived in an illusion of what family was supposed to be all these years? The next morning, I took the day off to care for Grandma at the hospital. I arrived early, around 6 a.m., bringing Uncle Mike coffee and a breakfast sandwich. When I walked into the ICU room, Uncle Mike was sitting beside Grandma's bed, his eyes red and heavy from lack of sleep. After staying up all night worrying and caring for her, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. His face was lined with exhaustion. His graying hair was messy, and his shoulders slumped under the weight of fatigue. Uncle Mike stood up with a tired smile when he saw me and said, "You're here early." Hearing the rasp in his voice, I felt a pang of sympathy and replied, "You should go home and get some rest. I'll stay with Grandma." At first, he refused. He knew I had a family to support and didn't want me missing work. He shook his head and said, "No need, I've got this. You should get back to your job." But when I told him I had already taken the day off to stay at the hospital, he finally gave in. Before leaving, he gently patted my shoulder and said softly, "Thank you, Wendy. Your grandma's lucky to have you." At that moment, I felt genuine affection and gratitude from my uncle. It was the kind of thing I had never once received from my father. By noon, everyone in the family had shown up at the hospital, including my parents and Morgan. They arrived with blank expressions, as if visiting Grandma was nothing more than a box they needed to check. There was no sign of concern or emotion on their faces. My dad entered the room for exactly 5 minutes, then walked out. My mom and Morgan didn't even step inside. They just stood at the doorway and glanced in. I decided it was time to speak up. Once everyone had gathered in the hallway, looking each person in the eye, I said thoughtfully, "There are 8 of us, so let's take turns caring for Grandma. 1 person per day until she's discharged." I had barely finished my sentence when Uncle Mike responded with conviction, "I'm all in." Aunt Patricia nodded and added, "This is what we should do." Daniel didn't object either. He said he had arranged to work remotely during this time so he could help more. He looked at me and said, "Wendy's right. We're family." But my parents and Morgan had a completely different reaction. My dad shook his head and replied with irritation, "I'm too busy. Whoever's free can take care of her." Right after that, my mom chimed in with a similar excuse. She said, "My company doesn't allow personal leave. I hope everyone understands." Morgan also jumped in to reject the idea. She claimed her work was critical. "I'm in the middle of negotiating a contract worth nearly $400,000. I can't step away. Please understand." Their string of refusals made both Uncle Mike and me furious. The atmosphere in the hospital hallway grew so tense that it felt suffocating. Unable to hold back, Uncle Mike stepped before my parents, looked them straight in the eye, and said coldly, "You should take a long look at yourselves. This is your mother." But instead of reconsidering their behavior or showing even a shred of shame, my parents and Morgan turned their backs and walked away, leaving the five of us standing in an angry, heavy silence. After they left, even though it was just the five of us, we sat down and made a detailed schedule to take care of Grandma. Each of us had our responsibilities, jobs, and busy lives, but we all understood that Grandma needed us, and this was our duty. As I sat there with the other four working together to plan Grandma's care, I realized something clearly. Family isn't defined by blood, it's characterized by action and by genuine care. After 4 days in the hospital, Grandma finally woke up, but there was one thing none of us saw coming. Her personality had changed entirely. On the first day she regained consciousness, while Nurse Jennifer was checking her vital signs, Grandma suddenly shouted in a sharp, angry voice, "Don't touch me! I don't need you checking anything." Startled, Nurse Jennifer glanced at me, then gently tried to explain. "Mrs. Brenda, I just need to take your blood pressure." But instead of calming down, Grandma got even angrier. She threw her pillow at Nurse Jennifer and yelled, "I said don't touch me!" Another nurse came in shortly after. It took soft voices and soothing words to get through a basic checkup. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Grandma became unusually irritable and demanding. She asked for absurd things, ice cream at 3 a.m., fresh bed sheets 5 times a day, or she would scream at the slightest hallway noise. While I was reading a book to her, she suddenly snapped, "Why are you reading so slow? Read faster." Then barely 5 minutes later, she yelled again, "Slow down, I can't keep up." We quickly reported everything to Dr. Martinez. After examining her and reviewing her medical file, he explained the situation. He looked at us with empathy and said, "This behavior is a temporary side effect of the brain surgery. It should only last for a week or two. Her personality will gradually return to normal." Hearing that, we all understood and chose to be patient with her. Instead of feeling annoyed or frustrated, we did our best to care for her like she was a cranky little child. When she yelled, we calmly reassured her. When she threw things, we quietly picked them up and tidied the room without a word. William even said to me, "Remember when Emma was 2? She used to throw things and scream just like this. We were patient with her, so we'll be patient with Grandma too." We all hoped that after 2 weeks, she would return to her old self, the warm, gentle Grandma we all loved. And then, while Grandma was still in the hospital, something happened that pushed the tension in my family to a whole new level. It was the 10th day since Grandma had regained consciousness, and according to our care schedule, it was my day to look after her. I arrived at the hospital early in the morning with hot chicken soup and toasted bread, Grandma's favorite comfort food. Around 10 o'clock a.m., while I was reading the newspaper aloud to her, the door to the ICU room suddenly opened. All 3 of them, my parents and Morgan, walked in with serious expressions. I was stunned to see them, especially after they had walked away from the care schedule without a word. What shocked me even more, they didn't ask a single question about Grandma's health. No, "How are you feeling?" or "Are you okay?" Nothing. Instead, my dad walked straight up to the hospital bed, looked Grandma in the eye, and said flat, emotionless, "Mom, I need $200,000 for a major investment project. Can you mortgage the house and help me get that money?" Hearing those words, I felt like the blood in my veins had turned to ice. They weren't here to check on her. They came to ask for money. Grandma, still irritable from the effects of brain surgery, heard the question and immediately snapped, "You want to steal my house, don't you?" My dad tried to stay calm and explained, "I'm just asking you to co-sign the loan, that's all. I'll pay you back with interest." But Grandma was firm. She said, "I'm not borrowing for you. Go home." Her refusal was blunt and final. My dad's face turned red with anger, and he stood there frozen, not knowing what to say next. That's when my mom jumped in, her tone full of irritation. "See? I told you she wouldn't help. Why did you even bother coming to the hospital?" How she spoke about Grandma, like she was some stranger, not her mother, made my stomach turn. Then Morgan chimed in, her voice sharp and bitter. "I already said it. Grandma only cares about Uncle Mike's family and Wendy's. She doesn't care about us." Her words almost made me laugh out loud because of how absurd they were. I knew without a doubt that Grandma had never played favorites. They were the ones who never showed up, never called, never cared, who were now twisting things around as if they were the victims. A little while later, while they were still whispering about how to convince Grandma to mortgage the house, she suddenly pointed straight at my dad with a sharp, commanding voice. "Tyler, tomorrow you're coming to the hospital to take care of me." Hearing her unexpected request, my dad froze briefly, then calmly replied, "I've got something important at work tomorrow, aren't they?" He gestured toward me and the others. "Already taking great care of you?" Seeing him refuse, Grandma turned her head toward Morgan and said firmly, "If you can't do it, then Morgan will come take care of me. Since I was hospitalized, none of you have spent a single day caring for me." Morgan didn't even hesitate. Looking straight at Grandma, she answered coldly, "I'm in the middle of a $400,000 project. Find someone else." After being rejected twice, Grandma shifted her gaze to my mother, Lauren, and said, "Then Lauren will take care of me." And just like the others, my mom shook her head and gave a firm, final no. Realizing no one would step up, Grandma suddenly screamed in frustration, "If none of you take care of me, you'll regret it." Hearing that threat, my mom completely lost her patience. Ignoring the fact that Grandma was still lying in a fragile state, she shouted back harshly, "We are not your servants!" She stormed out of the room, leaving my dad and Morgan in a thick, suffocating silence. Grandma then turned to my dad with a look of heartbreak and asked, "You're just going to stand there and let your wife scream in my face?" I thought just for a moment that my dad might reflect, might even apologize on his wife's behalf, but the opposite happened. He looked at Grandma with cold eyes and said bluntly, "She's right. We're not your servants. If you agree to mortgage the house, then I'll consider your request." After that cruel remark, my dad grabbed Morgan by the arm and walked out of the hospital room, leaving Grandma covering her face in tears, crushed by the way her son and daughter-in-law had treated her. Watching that unfold, a wave of pain rose in my chest. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. These were the people I had once respected, my parents, now acting so heartlessly toward the woman who gave them life and raised them. At that moment, it became painfully clear to me that money has the power to reveal a person's true nature most brutally. 5 minutes after my parents and Morgan left, Grandma slowly lowered her hands from her face. But what struck me most wasn't a tear in her eyes. Even more surprising, she was smiling. That same warm, gentle smile I had known all my life before the accident ever happened. She looked at me with clear, bright eyes and asked softly, "Are they all gone yet?" I was stunned by the sudden change in her demeanor. Just minutes earlier, she'd been irritable, furious, and heartbroken. Now she seemed calm, clear-headed, and entirely in control. I quickly got up and stepped into the hallway to check. After confirming they had truly left and the area was clear, I walked back into the room and said, "They're gone, Grandma." She gave a short nod and replied with quiet satisfaction, "Good. Now we've seen their true colors." Her words stopped me cold. I sat beside her, eyebrows raised, and asked with curiosity, "What do you mean by that, Grandma?" She gave me a soft smile before calmly explaining everything. That's when I learned the shocking truth. Ever since the day she woke up from brain surgery, Grandma had been wonderful. Every angry outburst, unreasonable demand, and tantrum was an act. She looked me in the eyes, now serious, and said, "I wanted the whole family to think I was unstable, to see who would still care when it wasn't easy." I asked immediately, "But why go through all that?" She smiled again mysteriously and answered, "I had my reasons, Wendy." Hearing that, I felt relieved knowing she was fully healthy. But at the same time, a new kind of curiosity began to build. My mind was racing with questions about her plan and why she had gone to such lengths. Still, I didn't press her further. I knew Grandma too well. She was incredibly sharp, always 5 steps ahead of everyone, and never did anything without a reason. Looking at her peaceful smile, I realized she had likely spent years quietly observing and understanding the true nature of everyone in the family. And in that moment, I felt a new kind of respect for her. Not just for her love and care, but for her wisdom, her insight, and the quiet strength she carried all along. After 2 weeks in the hospital, Grandma was finally discharged. In the following days, we kept up our schedule of taking turns caring for her. Each of us had 1 day a week to visit, cook, and ensure she had everything she needed. About a month after she came home, on a Friday, Grandma called and asked all of us, me and William, Uncle Mike's family, and Daniel, to be at her house at 10 o'clock a.m. on Saturday. Her voice was solemn when she said, "I have something important to announce to everyone." When we arrived on time, I was surprised to see a woman I didn't recognize sitting in the living room. She looked in her 50s, dressed in a neat black suit, holding a leather briefcase. After Grandma introduced her, we learned she was Patricia Morrison, her longtime attorney. A heavy silence filled the air once everyone had taken their seats in the living room. None of us knew what was coming. A few moments later, Grandma stood up, looked at each of us with her usual warm gaze, and calmly said, "Everyone here today will receive $3 million." The room went completely silent. We were all in shock. It felt unreal. A few seconds later, Patricia Morrison stood up and explained in more detail. Grandma had made several real estate investments back in the 1990s. In 2022, she sold all of them, bringing in $20 million. She had already written a will, intending to divide her wealth equally among her children and grandchildren after her death. Hearing that, it felt like a jolt ran down my spine. My heart was pounding, and I had to swallow hard to stay composed. I glanced at William. His mouth was open, eyes wide in disbelief. His hand gripped mine so tightly I could feel his fingernails pressing into my skin. Uncle Mike sat frozen in place, his face pale. He looked at Aunt Patricia, and the two exchanged a stunned glance, as if they were caught in some strange dream. Daniel took a long breath, shaking his head in disbelief, and whispered, "No way, Grandma." Emma, only 6 years old and unaware of what was happening, just sat quietly watching the grown-ups, her eyes filled with curiosity. As the lawyer continued explaining, I realized something. The woman we thought we had known all our lives had hidden incredible secrets, depths of wisdom, planning, and insight we had never imagined. Once we had a moment to collect ourselves, the attorney added, "But after the incident at the hospital and coming so close to death, Mrs. Brenda realized that some people in the family do not deserve this money, so she has decided to distribute $15 million among the 5 people present today. The remaining $5 million will go toward a charity fund for orphans." As for the house Grandma was living in, the attorney clarified, after Mrs. Brenda passes away, the house will be sold and the full proceeds will be donated to the same charity fund. Once the explanation was complete, Grandma looked at us meaningfully and said, "I hope you all use this money wisely, and I hope that money won't change the good in your hearts." Sitting in Grandma's living room that day, we felt like we had just hit the jackpot. But more than that, we felt a deep respect for the love, foresight, and wisdom of the woman who had brought us together. On the drive home after the meeting with the attorney, William and I sat in complete silence for the first 10 minutes. We were still trying to process the overwhelming news we had just received. After 10 long minutes, William gently turned toward me, sighed quietly, and said, "Can you believe what just happened?" Hearing his question, I realized my mind was still spinning from the shock. I shook my head, kept my eyes on the road, and replied, "I still can't wrap my head around it. $3 million. That's what we'd have to work 20 years for." But even as I said the words, a strange unease crept in. I turned to William with a concerned look and asked, "Do you think we deserve it? I mean, we cared for Grandma because we love her, not for the money." William placed his hand gently over mine, offered a calm smile, and said, "That's exactly why she chose us. She knew we did it out of love, not for any reward." His words brought me a sense of relief. When we got home, we sat on the sofa and began discussing how to use the money responsibly. William opened his laptop, looked at me, and suggested, "First, we should set aside a portion to buy a restaurant. Then we can put money into a college fund for Emma, maybe even upgrade to a bigger home." I nodded at his thoughtful plan, but added, "And we should also give some to charity, just like Grandma did." After we wrapped up the money talk, I looked at him seriously and said, "You need to know this money doesn't change anything. We'll still take care of Grandma the same way we always have. Not because we feel obligated or afraid of losing anything, but because we truly love her." William smiled warmly and replied, "You're right. What we feel for Grandma isn't something money can buy." His words reassured me. But even as I felt that sense of peace, another worry started to surface. I turned to him and asked uneasily, "What do you think Mom, Dad, and Morgan will do when they find out?" William sighed, met my eyes with a knowing look, and said, "You know they won't be happy, but that's the natural result of their own choices." During that moment, I knew he was right, and I also knew what came next wouldn't be easy. After everything that had happened, I understood one thing clearly. Money can open doors, but it can also bring challenges you never expected to face. A week after we received the money, Uncle Mike pulled off a bold move I never saw coming. He deliberately took a photo of the $3 million bank transfer confirmation and sent it to my dad via text. According to what he told me later, it took only a few minutes before my dad called him. His voice was panicked and furious. He demanded to know how Uncle Mike had come into that kind of money and why no one had told him anything about it. Uncle Mike played it vague on purpose, dropping cryptic hints that only made my dad more irritated and desperate for answers. Finally, when my dad pushed harder and demanded the truth, Uncle Mike accidentally let it slip. Grandma had distributed the money to the people who had cared for her during her recovery. Already anticipating what would happen next, Uncle Mike called me right after and said, "You should come over to Grandma's. The show's about to start." I hesitated, concerned about the fallout, but curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. Uncle Mike was already there when I arrived at Grandma's house, casually chatting with her in the living room. What surprised me most wasn't that he was calm, but that Grandma wasn't upset with him at all. She praised him for what he'd done. Grandma explained that she had known about his plan from the start and had given her full approval. In her words, this was the only way to expose the true nature of those who only cared about money. "This will teach them a lesson they'll never forget," she said firmly. Sitting in her house, I could feel it. The final confrontation was coming, and Grandma was more than ready to face her son and daughter-in-law head-on. 2 hours after finding out about the money, my parents and Morgan showed up outside Grandma's gate. They came looking furious and panicked, clearly shaken by the news they'd gotten from Uncle Mike. But Grandma was ready for this confrontation. She didn't open the gate. Instead, she stood firm behind the iron bars, her posture cold and unshakable. Uncle Mike and I stood on either side of her like silent guards at the showdown. As soon as my dad saw her, he lost control. He yelled out in frustration, "This isn't fair, Mom! Why does everyone else get money but not me? I'm your son too!" But Grandma didn't flinch. She locked eyes with him, her voice icy as she asked, "Do you remember what happened at the hospital?" Hearing that, my dad went quiet for a moment. Then he tried to deflect, saying, "That was nothing, Mom. We had important work to do. And we did come visit you, didn't we?" Trying to downplay what happened only made things worse. Grandma couldn't hold it in anymore. She raised her voice with undeniable authority and snapped, "Shut your mouth!" All three of them went silent instantly. Then Grandma turned to my mother, Lauren, and asked coldly, "Do you remember what you said to me in the hospital?" My mom's face turned pale. Her voice trembled as she denied it. "I didn't say anything, Mom. I don't remember saying anything wrong." But Grandma wasn't letting it slide. She said sharply, "I still have $5 million left. If you had just admitted what you said, maybe I would have reconsidered." That line hit like a thunderclap. When my dad heard money was still left on the table, he immediately turned to my mom and shouted in anger, "You idiot! Apologize to her now." Realizing it might be their last chance, my mom quickly pleaded, "Mom, I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. Please forgive me. I'll take care of you from now on." But it was already too late. Grandma looked at them with absolute disgust. Then she turned to Uncle Mike and said calmly, "Mike, call the police." She looked back at them and declared, her voice steady and ruthless, "I am not your servant, and starting today, I no longer have children like you." With that, she turned her back and walked into the house, leaving them outside the gate, begging and pleading. 10 minutes later, a police siren echoed down the street. 2 officers exited the car and told them to leave the property. My parents and Morgan left with no other choice, faces filled with frustration and regret. Watching them walk away, I knew that this day marked the end of the family ties they had chosen to destroy with their actions. After the police intervened, my parents no longer dared to show up at Grandma's house. Instead, they switched tactics, calling her nonstop, begging and pleading for forgiveness. But that only lasted for 1 day. By the second day, when they tried calling again, the number was no longer in service. Grandma had asked me to buy her a new phone and number, cutting off all contact with her ungrateful children for good. Over the next month, William and I used part of the money Grandma had given us to buy a bigger house, a 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood in Denver, Colorado. It had a spacious yard and all the amenities needed for a comfortable, multi-generational home. When we received the keys, I stopped by Grandma's house, bringing Uncle Mike with me. We both wanted to convince her to move in with us. At first, she refused. She didn't want to disrupt our lives or feel like a burden. But with heartfelt persuasion from all of us, Grandma finally agreed. We truly wanted her with us, not out of obligation or guilt, but out of love. And honestly, we were also worried. We knew my parents and Morgan wouldn't let things go so easily, and we didn't want Grandma alone to deal with their bitterness. Her presence in our new home brought a sense of warmth and joy we hadn't realized we were missing. Emma had someone to tell her bedtime stories to again. William gained an excellent kitchen companion. And I had peace of mind knowing Grandma was finally in a place where she was loved, protected, and cared for exactly as she deserved. 2 years have passed since Grandma moved in with us. She's now 76, but still remarkably healthy after that terrifying accident. She's up early watering the garden and playing with Emma before school every morning. As for our life, thanks to the money Grandma gave us, we bought a large restaurant in downtown Denver. Business has been thriving with steady crowds and great reviews. We now employ 15 staff members. William runs the kitchen. I handle customer service, and Grandma occasionally comes by to sip tea and chat with regulars. Uncle Mike and his family are doing well too. He's expanded his auto repair shop, and Daniel was promoted to a management position at his tech company in Seattle, though he still flies home regularly to visit. Unfortunately, not everyone's story ended that way. My parents and Morgan paid a heavy price for their choices. Over the past 2 years, their lives unraveled. They lost all their savings and had to sell their house to pay off debts after a string of poor investments. Morgan was fired for her poor attitude at work and is now unemployed. There was one time about a year ago when, out of desperation, my parents and Morgan came to our restaurant and caused a scene. They shouted, disrupted customers, and made a mess. I didn't argue. I didn't try to reason with them. I calmly called the police. They were fined $8,000 for disturbing the peace. I'm not telling this story to brag about what I have today. I'm sharing it to remind us of a simple truth in life. When we care for our family and show up for the people who raised us, we receive love and blessings in return. But when we act selfishly and turn our backs on those who care for us, life has a way of returning that energy. And before I end the story, I want to ask you something. If your grandmother or grandfather needed your care, would you be willing to put everything else on hold to be there for them? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear from you. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for sticking with me through this long story.